This Mitsubishi Pajero 3.0 was one of the most popular off-roaders of the 90s, a true icon of rugged adventure. Today, let's take a closer look at this beast from a golden era of SUVs. After years of battling the elements, the fuel system is probably in rough shape, but that doesn't take away from the car's legendary status in my heart. This particular one is the high roof version, while there's also a flat roof variant. I prefer the high roof. It just looks more powerful. The leather seats have seen better days and will need a full reupholstering. It's a manual transmission, but if I could find an automatic, that'd be even more fun. Check this out. You can still switch between 4-wheel drive and 2-wheel drive on the fly. It's got a classic 3-gauge cluster, a level gauge, an altimeter, and a thermometer. And here's the crazy part. I paid just about $1,500 for it. That's all it takes to feel like a wealthy 90s off-roader. Spare tire mounted on the back, just like the high-end models of the time. Still timeless. Now let's take a look inside. The interior definitely shows its age, but guess what? This thing had power seats back in the 90s. The steering wheel is worn, the trim has that aged patina, and there's wood paneling all over. This was peak luxury back then. To buy one of these brand new, you had to drop serious cash. No financing, no easy payments. Just straight up cash. If you owned one back then, you weren't just anybody. Under the hood, it's rocking a 3.0-liter V6 with a 12-valve 6G72 engine. 6 cylinders always hit differently, but I'll admit, this engine feels a little underpowered. The rear has fold-down jump seats, making it a 7-seater. Pretty cool, right? When not in use, the seats fold up to create more cargo space. Now let's fire it up. I was half expecting it not to start, but here we are, smooth as butter. It's got that old-school, boat-like ride. And the brakes, surprisingly solid. That's a relief, because the last thing you want is bad brakes in an old SUV. The car has over 140,000 miles on it, but it's still running strong. Though I'm hearing a few odd noises from the engine. Nothing too surprising for a vehicle this old. But think about it. Back in the day, owning one of these meant you were living large. And now, I got my hands on one for the price of a used couch. That being said, it's got its fair share of problems. The engine and transmission both need major work. The interior is falling apart and needs a complete overhaul. The exterior? Definitely due for a fresh coat of paint. But once I restore it, it's going to be a proper off-road beast again. So here's the plan. I picked up this Mitsubishi Pajero for $1,800, and I'm turning it into a true off-road monster. Take a good look at it now, because soon you won't even recognize it. First step, stripping out the entire interior. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it right. Every single piece is coming out to make way for a full restoration. Oh, what's this? Found an old coin under the seat. Guess this car came with hidden treasure? But no time to waste, there's work to do. The seats alone have already eaten up a chunk of my time, but this is just the beginning. Stay tuned, because this Pajero is getting a second life. Turns out the switch was jammed. Gave it a good pull, and finally it opened up. The lock and key mechanism is acting up too. Tried drilling, but that didn't work either. Guess I'll have to spend more time fixing it. And what's this? Just found a crisp $20 bill tucked away in here. Not bad at all. But no matter how lucky I get, time hasn't been kind to this car. The seats are completely shot, and reupholstering them is going to cost me a good chunk of cash. Look at the padding inside. Would you dare sit on that? Gotta be careful when removing the interior. After years of sun exposure, the plastic is brittle. The classic Mitsubishi gauge cluster is still here, but none of them work anymore. I'll have to source replacements. Working in this summer heat is brutal, but thankfully, my buddy hooked up a fan to keep things cool. The headliner? Surprisingly still intact. Gotta hand it to Mitsubishi for that build quality. Now on to the real issues. The engine and transmission both need major work. One step at a time, finally got this Pajero stripped down. Looking at all the parts scattered across the floor, one thing is clear. Without a solid frame, this car wouldn't stand a chance. Oil leaks everywhere. First things first, gotta drain and replace all the fluids. This is exactly why I love restoring old cars. There's something deeply satisfying about bringing a rust bucket back to life. No way around it. This engine needs a full rebuild. Gotta crack it open to see if there are any hidden surprises inside. The interior is completely worn out too, so I'll need to rewrap the seats and deep clean everything to make it look fresh again. The frame, useless, completely rusted through. Look at this, corroded and filled with debris. The whole thing has to come apart. Compared to my last two projects, this one's actually in decent shape. Took just a day to strip the interior, and now my garage looks like a scrapyard. But there's still more to do. The chassis and body need to be separated. The paint is completely faded, so a full respray is in order. I'm sticking with the original green. This color is iconic for the Pajero. All right, folks, give me some time, and I'll bring this Pajero Avu 33 back to its former glory. If you love classic SUVs, you won't want to miss this build. Back in the 90s, driving one of these meant you were somebody. Now, I snagged this thing for just $1,800 and get to experience that old-school luxury. To make this restoration perfect, I completely tore the whole car apart. From the first test drive, I noticed a strange noise coming from the engine. Time to dig in and find out what's wrong. This big V6 is over 2 decades old. An engine rebuild is inevitable. Just hoping I don't run into too many costly surprises. European cars back then had timing chains, but I still prefer these old-school Japanese timing belts. The problem? These belts are ancient. Every single one needs to be replaced. Same with the oil lines. None of them are salvageable. And for those who say Japanese cars don't leak oil, think again. So was this Pajero worth the $1,800? That all depends on what's inside the engine. If it's in decent shape, I got a hell of a deal. Now let's crack this thing open. It's like opening a mystery box. Seeing an old car with its engine removed is nothing unusual, but it looks like the previous owner attempted a rebuild. Look here, excessive wear on some components, and that's what's causing the weird knocking noise. On top of that, the last owner swapped out a few parts, so now I have to measure the crankshaft, pistons, and bearings to see if they're still usable. If they check out, I'll be saving a lot of money. Wait a minute, looks like I just hit the jackpot. If I don't need to replace too much, I picked up an old Mitsubishi Pajero, thinking it would be a fun restoration project. But the moment I popped the hood and looked inside, I knew I was in for way more than I had bargained for. The engine bay was a disaster. Rat droppings everywhere, thick layers of oil sludge caked onto every surface, and rust so bad that some parts looked like they'd been sitting at the bottom of a river for years. It was obvious this thing hadn't been maintained properly, and whatever life it had left was hanging by a thread. But hey, if you're gonna do something, might as well do it right. So I went all in. First, I completely stripped the car down. The Pajero has a body-on-frame design, which means the entire body can be separated from the chassis. This made the restoration process easier in some ways, but also meant I had to take absolutely everything apart. Every nut, every bolt, every last piece had to be removed. And when I say everything, I mean everything. By the time I was done, I was staring at a pile of parts and a shell of a car. Moving the heavy frame wasn't exactly easy either, so my buddy, an experienced mechanic with decades of experience, put together a special dolly system that let me move the chassis around the workshop more easily. The heart of the Pajero was its 6G72 V6 engine, and it was in rough shape. The cylinders were worn, but after some careful measuring, I realized they could be oversized slightly, which gave me room to work with. That meant new pistons, a freshly machined block, and a full set of new gaskets and seals. And this time, I wasn't about to scrub every part by hand like I usually do. This time, I used an ultrasonic cleaner to get everything spotless. If there's one thing I've learned from working on old engines, it's that built-up sludge is your worst enemy. If you knock it loose the wrong way, it can clog oil passages and ruin an engine in no time. So I took my time, cleaned everything meticulously, and made sure every single component was as close to factory condition as possible. With all the engine parts cleaned and ready, I started reassembling the beast. No factory manual, no step-by-step guide, just good old-fashioned mechanical knowledge and patience. Piece by piece, the V6 came back together. Every bolt was torqued to spec, every gasket sealed perfectly. When the final part was in place, it was time for the big moment, the first start. I wired everything up, double-checked my work, and turned the key. And nothing. No crank, no spark, just silence. After hours of troubleshooting, I found the issue. The starter motor had burned out. Typical. Another delay, another part to replace. But that's how these restorations go. Once the new starter was in place, I gave it another shot. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. That moment alone made all the effort worth it. But the job wasn't finished yet. The Pajero's body was in terrible condition. Scratched, dented, covered in peeling paint and rust spots. The frame needed repairs, the suspension was shot, and the interior looked like it had been used as a storage unit for the past decade. This build wasn't just about making the car run. It had to look and feel like new again. The restoration process had 4 major stages: repainting the body, rebuilding the mechanical components, restoring the interior, and finally putting everything back together. Sanding, priming, painting. It took countless hours, but the Pajero's body finally looked as clean and smooth as it did when it rolled off the production line. The interior was stripped and reupholstered, the dashboard repaired, and every single worn-out piece was either replaced or refurbished. No shortcuts, no cheap fixes, just a full, proper restoration. After putting in all that, I picked up this old Mitsubishi Pajero, knowing it was going to be a project, but I didn't expect just how much work it would take. The moment I started stripping it down, I realized this wasn't just a simple restoration. It was a complete rebuild. The body was riddled with rust and dents, the paint was peeling, and underneath it all, the engine was in worse shape than I'd imagined. But hey, when you take on a project like this, you commit to seeing it through. The first step was dealing with the bodywork. Every dent, every rust spot had to be repaired, and that meant stripping the paint, sanding everything smooth, and fixing any weak spots in the frame. The entire chassis was cleaned inside and out, making sure there was no dirt or corrosion left before applying a protective undercoat. This would prevent rust and corrosion while also providing some soundproofing. Once that was done, it was time to prep for paint. I wanted to keep the Pajero's classic look, so I went with its signature two-tone finish, a deep metallic green paired with a warm sand-colored lower half. The fresh paint job brought it back to life, and thanks to the skilled hands of a veteran painter, the finish turned out flawless. Next up was the mechanical work. When I first test drove it, I knew something was off. The engine had a strange knocking sound. To find the issue, I had to tear the whole thing apart. Whoever worked on it before had cut some serious corners, and it showed. The moment I opened up the intake manifold, I was met with a horror scene. Rat droppings everywhere, and parts so dirty they looked like they'd been sitting at the bottom of a junkyard. It was clear the engine needed a full rebuild. After a detailed inspection, I found that the valve lifters and some of the internal components were worn down. Fortunately, the damage wasn't beyond repair. I replaced all the necessary parts, refinished the metal surfaces, and made sure everything was cleaned and lubricated before reassembling the engine. After days of hard work, it was finally ready to fire up. The suspension and chassis were still in decent shape, but they needed some attention. After cleaning, I gave the entire undercarriage a fresh coat of black paint, giving it a tough, rugged look. Then came the interior. Every component had to be removed, sorted, and restored one by one. Some of the upholstery was beyond saving, so I decided to replace it entirely. I went with a two-tone theme: Porsche graphite blue combined with an elegant ivory white. The seats were reupholstered, the panels refinished, and every piece was meticulously restored. The result? A cabin that felt brand new, with a blend of luxury and classic off-road charm. The wheels were another challenge. The original rims were in terrible condition, so I had no choice but to source a used set. Of course, they weren't in perfect shape either, so I refinished them using electroplating to bring back their shine. The difference was night and day. The fresh wheels instantly elevated the Pajero's entire look. Looking at the pile of parts scattered across the workshop, it was clear just how much effort had gone into this restoration. Now, with everything finally ready, it was time for the final assembly. Piece by piece, the Pajero was put back together, and when the last bolt was tightened, it stood there, fully restored, looking just as it did when it first rolled off the factory floor. With the last few adjustments made, it was time for the moment of truth. I turned the key, and just like that, the engine roared to life. No hesitation, no struggling, just smooth, powerful ignition. It was a satisfying end to an intense restoration. Some people see an old broken-down car and think it's not worth saving. But for me, bringing something back from the brink, giving it a second life, is what makes it all worth it. This Pajero isn't just another project, it's a piece of history, and now it's finally back where it belongs.